So it's good to be together. The storm has blown through. And there's just simply a deep sense of stability and comfort when we're here in this place on Sunday mornings. The music, the warmth, the care, the gratitude. Being in community matters, and after an event like a hurricane, it's important to be together. Now, we have not heard of any serious issues due to the storm within the congregation, but we still have friends without power, and that's a little taxing on them. So if you have no power yet, raise your hand. Sorry. You're in the minority. It will happen sooner than later. I want to thank those who helped clean up on Thursday. The campus was a serious mess, and there's still a lot more to do, but we'll get to that as we go. I also want to thank those of you who made phone calls checking in on each other after the storm. And so what we did learn is that some of our information in the computer is not so accurate. So we're going to try to be a little more intentional while updating our contact numbers. And so those calls are really important to Karen and Corey and I, because we need to know how you are and if there are serious needs that we can be responsive to. So we're going to be asking you to help us update our computer information in preparation for the next storm, whenever that is. So when something like a hurricane happens, particularly when it's this close, there's a lot of time for me to sit in the dark and ponder. And oddly enough, I reflected a lot on what I put in my must keep dry and protect at all costs container. Now, the important papers are assumed. The essentials, I'm not talking so much about my passport and credit cards. I've been thinking about the other stuff I put in that protect at all costs container, and I realized that the mental health people might have fun at analyzing the things I put in. My favorite picture of Karen and the kids when they were young, all my fountain pens with extra nibs. I put the Ted Williams and Mickey Mantle baseball, autographed baseball in there. My father's published paper for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, entitled, by the way, Half-Bead Repair Welding for Heavy Section Steel Technology Program Vessels. I did try to read it. I put an original Ruth Pettis piece of art that my mother gave me after I graduated from seminary with the verse from 1 John 3:18. Our love should not be just words and talk. It must be true love, which shows itself in actions. I put the rock in from my first rebuilding trip in Nicaragua in 1998, and my little Buddha statue, which stays on that rock and sits on the top of my desk. My ornamental 18th hole flag from St. Andrews in the box. My coffee mugs from Van Morrison Louisville Seminary in the box. So I put a bunch of stuff in my have to protect at all costs container. And I also realized that it does say something about me. And I also want you to know I'm not spending any money for therapy to find out the answer. But what I know is that those things matter to me and are reminders of moments that I've experienced, achievements that I and other important people in my life have accomplished. They are a reminder of challenges I've faced, succeeding in some and failing in others, reminders of the relationships I value and have known. So a disaster seems to make me more aware of how sincerely grateful I am for the people who are present in my life and reminders of all the saints who have played this significant role along my journey, the people who have helped make me be me, good, bad, and ugly. So a disaster is a tragic occurrence, and there is suffering, despondency, loss, and grief. And after a disaster, one's ability to cope is often challenged. And really a definition of a disaster is an event that exceeds one's ability to cope. So let me say that not only is an individual or neighborhood or community wrecked by a disaster, but our theology takes a big hit as well. Disasters not only destroy the physical world and the resources needed to get on with living, but it leaves this lingering, long-term, hidden effect. And one of those effects is the loss of trusting in God. And that's the theological issue. So I saw a picture of a storm blowing over us, and it was about midnight at the height of the storm. And the person who showed it to me said, "Did you see the heart?" So I'm not really good at deciphering abstract images in modern art at all. So to show me that there was a heart, he swiped to the next picture on his phone, and they had whiteboarded an outline of a heart over the storm at the height of when it was blowing in, and it was over Sarasota, as if it was an intentional heart, an act. And that's the theological difficulties. God put a heart over us, and that means that God did not put a heart over other people. Now, the picture was interesting, probably a coping mechanism to deal with the stressors of the disaster, but in doing so, we say something not true about God. We make God a villain. And that's a theological problem. Because the next time, and there is a next time, Maria is on its way in the Atlantic. God may become a villain to us, but we're good and faithful people who love the Lord. This past week in the opinion section of the Herald Tribune, someone wrote, "I did an impromptu survey of my neighbors as I was preparing for Irma. With massive wildfires in the West and hurricanes in Texas and Florida, people are asking, what is God telling us? The result of my unofficial neighborhood survey, neighbor number 1 said it was over our decadent lifestyle with no caring for family values. Neighbor 2, I'm reading this, okay? This is not making it up, which I could have, but I didn't. Neighbor number 2 said that hurricanes are hitting areas that voted for Trump. Neighbor number 3 said, it only started when we pulled down the monuments. Me, I say it's not God. It's more heat energy in the oceans. ChristianNet.com, this fundamentalist Christian portal, reported that 52% of those who surveyed felt strongly that increasing disasters, especially in the United States, are the result of God's judgment on America's sinfulness. That's a theological problem. As difficult as disasters are, and as challenging as everyday life is, we need sound theology. I remember a Peanuts cartoon that shows Lucy and Linus standing at this big glass window watching torrential downpour of rain. And Lucy says, "Boy, look at that rain. What if it floods the whole world?" The second frame has Linus thoughtfully responding, "It will never do that, Lucy. In the 9th chapter of Genesis, God promises never to send a flood to the whole world again. God even puts a rainbow in the sky as a sign of that promise. Next frame, Lucy looks at Linus approvingly and then looks out again at the storm. She says, Linus, you've taken a great load off my mind. Next frame, Linus replies, Lucy, sound theology has a way of doing that. So I want to do a little bit of theology before we move on, because theology does matter. Theology impacts the way that we respond. It determines how we relate to God, how we interpret the events like a disaster or a crisis or a difficult time. It matters in how we communicate our beliefs to others. God is not in the business of causing natural disasters and tragedy. God is the giver of life, the redeemer and sustainer of life. And contrary to those 52%ers, God does not use natural disasters as a form of judgment. Nor does God use natural disasters to teach us important lessons. Natural disasters are not God's plan to help us evangelize others. God's deepest purpose in the world is to create and to redeem and sustain us, to keep us in relationship with one another. God does not give up on creation, but continuously creative, constantly redeeming, ever present in sustaining creation, even and through the choices we make. But God always chooses us. God always chooses to be with us, to be for us always. The Apostle Paul says we are more than conquerors. And he doesn't deny the bad, ugly, dangerous, devastating, and suffering in life. He knows that they are simply a part of our journey, our adventure. But he boldly declares that nothing can separate us. Faith then emerges, sometimes so unrecognized, but yet keeps us going, facing and moving forward. Faith, sound theology, insists on dealing with reality, with life and relationships, and through dealing with those situations, new forms of faith emerge. Even in disaster, there's a still, steady voice to speak into the face of a convenient, cheap theology and fundamentalism. For Linus reminds us that sound theology makes a difference. It helps us to listen better. It deepens our understanding of God and strengthens our relationships with one another. Sound theology settles our core. It calms our being, bringing the sense of peace. What does Jesus says to his disciples? And they're facing the same kind of hurricane, one just as destructive and one just as deadly. He says to them, peace I leave with you. Because in the midst of fear and it brings anxiety, fear brings worry, dread, restlessness, it brings panic and tension, and none of that leads us to faithfulness. Fear does not lead us to being more faithful. The peace of Jesus, that which Jesus offers us, accepts the reality of trouble and danger and even disasters, and no matter what comes, no matter what name we give the next storm, God is present. Because biblical peace, the peace that Jesus offers, is the recognition of the goodness of life. And the goodness of life is not touched by the storms that happen. That goodness of life settles us to use the full capacities of our resources to deal with the hurricanes that blow upon us, or the relationships that go askew, or the medical problems that we are faced, because peace in times of trouble positions us to be more faithful. So sound theology settles us and brings us the presence of peace, the peace that Jesus offers, not the peace of the world. But it does something else. Sound theology also empowers us to respond to the needs of others. So we did dodge this storm. However you want to phrase it, we dodged this storm, but others did not. And now we get to be Christ-like to them. So go back with me to that verse of Ruth Pettis' piece of art. Our love should just not be words and talk, but true love shows itself in action. And action is what we do when there is need, because we have the capacity, the resources, and the ability to be Christ's hands and feet. So true love, which shows itself in action, is like Jerry and Trudy Hall, who unlocked their doors to let a couple stay safe as the storm blew over their home. True love, which shows itself in action, is like those who have given over $1,500 and brought in a bunch of supplies for cleanup kits. True love in action is like the small group who are heading to Bethel tomorrow to deliver foods and fun. True love, which shows itself in action, is like Russ and Megan Natherson opening their home to 4 strangers from Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, and then sent them home on their way down south with air mattresses. True love, which shows itself in action, is the funds we're able to provide for short-term relief so families can stay in hotels. True love, which shows itself in action, will be like how we respond to the severe damage at Mission Peniel, our ministry to farm workers in the south part. And true love, Ingemar, will show itself in action, will be with those who travel to areas to help clean up and rebuild homes. Sound theology, it's really important because it empowers us to respond to the needs of others. So in this response time, in the times of trouble and disaster, it is about good theology, sound theology, which shows itself in love. It is the visible expression of our faith, the presence of discipleship, and the witness to love for neighbors. True love, which shows itself in action, is the practice of theology, the theology of presence that allows God to do God's work in and through us. Difficulties, devastations, disasters happen, and we don't have any control where the wind blows. With sound theology, we are best positioned and empowered to respond to the needs of others. Dear friends, theology matters. And nothing in all of creation can ever separate us from God's love in Christ Jesus. That matters. Be filled with Christ's peace this day, and let us be Christ-like to others tomorrow. Amen and amen.